Good evening, everyone. I'm not going to moan about the weather. Enough people are doing that. I'd like to introduce... I should introduce myself, should I?
Yeah, might be an idea.
Should I introduce you first, Tom? What would you prefer?
I can introduce you, couldn't I? We could
Go for it.
mix it up.
Who am I?
Oh no, I didn't expect you to actually take me up on that.
We're both from Portsmouth or nearby. Does anyone know where Portsmouth is?
Yes.
Yeah.
Someone mentioned Southampton earlier, so I'm a bit triggered now. So.
A bit edgy. The mere mention of Southampton gets you going.
It's not good for our people, is it? Speaking of anxiety, which we soon will be.
There's a few other people from Hampshire or nearby. There's one person who grew up in West Sussex, so keep an eye out for him. Watch your possessions. Anyway, I'll stop prattling on. We're both travel writers, basically. Tom's written a few books, the latest of which, I won't go into all of them, but the latest of which brings us here tonight. It's called The Years of Travelling Anxiously. I've certainly had a fair few anxious moments travelling, but maybe not years of them. So I won't tell you all about it, because Tom will get there in the end, and then I'll ask questions about it. But I decided, being short of time on this occasion, I thought I'd lean on AI a bit, and I asked AI to write a paragraph of travel writing in the style of Tom Sykes. And do you know what it said? It said, "No thanks, I can't be asked." It's becoming very human, isn't it? This AI
a
stuff.
tool of taste and discretion. Definitely.
No, I definitely didn't lean on AI, because my first question is, just to get us going, something like, you know what a meal deal is?
Yeah, I think so. What, the supermarkets where you get a sandwich and a packet of crisps?
Yeah.
And,
What would be your sort of perfect meal deal?
Well, if you play the meal deal game right, you can get like a really expensive drink, can't you? Like rather than just getting a can of soda or something, you can get what would otherwise be a really expensive
Like coconut
smoothie
water
or sort of cocoa water. That's the one, isn't it?
So basically, you're after value for money.
Yeah. Do the supermarkets know that there's this flaw in the whole meal deal plan? I don't know. But anyway, yeah, that's what turns me on about meal deals. boring as that might sound.
Okay, I won't go into any further questions.
But what about
the
you?
nature of the sandwich or the snack or whatever.
Yeah. Your meal deals?
Gosh, I should have thought about that. I don't necessarily seek value for money these days. I go for the sandwich with the least amount of saturated fat, because I know if I do otherwise, I'll get an absolute rollicking from my partner.
Oh right, okay.
Yeah.
Looking out for your health.
If I come back with a sandwich that's got more than one meat product in it, that's it. I've had it. Tom,
Good,
let's move
okay,
on from the meal deal. We have learnt something about you.
Yes.
How did you get here?
In terms of the book, I suppose is what you mean, or do you mean kind of just in general?
No, I don't mean mode of transport. Like, how did we all get here? Right, so about mid-40s, something like that?
I'm 46, yeah.
Grew up in...
I just look old for my age.
You look good for your age. We both look like mid-30s, latest. But yeah, how did you come to get into writing, travelling, publishing, etc.? Feel free to provide a small bio.
Yeah, I mean, in a way, it's sort of what I go into in the book, which is very autobiographical, and is about my sort of struggle with anxiety, but my love of travel and the kind of contradictions inherent in that is also bound up with why I became a writer and my love of writing and why I committed myself to that. So I talk about my earliest memory of feeling any anxiety at all in the book, and that would have been probably when I was sort of 5 or 6, maybe a bit older, and I got lost in the supermarket, as a lot of us did. But I just remember this, I couldn't find my mum anywhere amongst the kind of forest of shell suit legs. It was the mid-80s, with shell suit legs and stone-washed jeans, which we both seem to be wearing today. We didn't plan that, did we? But are they? Oh, okay.
Yeah, they're
I'll
back
take your word for
50%
it.
off.
Okay, this is a London thing, and I'm from Portsmouth, and I wouldn't know how this retro... Anyway, sorry. So yeah, I got lost
You're in Iceland or Asda or something like that?
Yeah.
Your mum's abandoned you?
In Havant, which
in a
is...
shell suit?
Basically, yeah, she didn't wear shell suits, but there's lots of shell suits around. And and I just had this feeling of absolute terror and this kind of these sort of horrible fantasies of like, what happens if I never find my mum? Am I going to have to kind of set up camp between the pot noodles and packets of Start cereal or whatever, stuff that you can you get Start cereal anymore? I'm not sure, but anyway, I'm just trying to set the scene. But
so you weren't just sort of panicking; you were sort of catastrophizing.
I was
What
catastrophizing.
if I end up stranded here?
And I think that set for some time, I was sort of quite an anxious child, really, and and it was about about dependence, feeling like I was sort of dependent on my parents, and couldn't be on my own. If I ended up on my own, then I would be in trouble, and I'd get confused and anxious. That coincided with staying. I mean, or the upshot of that was to sort of, I'd spent a lot of time staying indoors, which meant I read a lot, and that led me towards writing, because I think everyone who gets into writing, you start off as a reader, don't you, and you really appreciate other people's stories, and there's a point where you think, okay, I might be able to have a go at that myself. And so the sort of beginnings of anxiety and the beginnings of becoming a writer are kind of quite tied up in that way. And I think my decision later in life to get into travelling was about trying to be more independent and therefore conquering the anxiety. But ironically, once I got travelling, new sort of forms of anxiety arose, which I talk about in the book.
We'll get to those. Going back to the supermarket, do you think that was a formative moment, that terror? And do you think sort of anxiety, at the roots of anxiety can be a bunch of different things, I'm sure, but can sort of trauma be one of them, as well as grief and unmet needs? You sort of talk about this in the book, don't you? Do you think that moment in the supermarket was a formative experience?
Yeah, I do. I think I do. I mean, I apart from that, I didn't have an unhappy childhood. So there aren't obvious kind of reasons as to why I might have become an anxious person later in life, and necessarily in that way. But I suppose there were sort of things like my parents getting divorced when I was 13 wasn't a very and again, there was probably tied up with that were kind of feelings of maybe being abandoned and that sort of question of dependence and independence sort of coming in again. But that's, I mean, it is genuinely a puzzle for me, what causes my travel anxiety in particular, and therefore that seemed to be worth writing a book about, because if the cause and effect were as simple as like every time I step on a plane I have a panic attack, then it's like I wouldn't fly anywhere, and there wouldn't be it would be a very, very short book, or it wouldn't be a story at all, or I dreaded some particular aspect. If it were that easy that you could sort of say, well, this input leads to that output, or this event leads to that event, but it's actually been a lot more complicated than that. I mean, we can maybe get into that more shortly.
Yeah, I think at some point we might have to tackle the slipperiness of the term anxiety.
That's true.
Because it's a murky phenomenon, isn't it? What are we talking about when we talk about anxiety exactly?
I mean, there is a debate about that, and there are disagreements between. I mean, I should say that I'm not medically trained, and I make this very clear at the beginning of the book. That it's not a self-help book, and I'm not trying to dispense advice, because I'm not qualified to. And frankly, if you're looking to me as your guru, then you're probably in a very dark place indeed, and I won't be able to help you out of that dark place.
Well, you might be surprised actually. I appreciate the caveats, but having read it twice now, I think it would bring a lot of solace and direction and inspiration to many people.
Oh, good. Well, thank you. I mean, I suppose I'm just speaking as a sufferer and as someone who's experienced it, and if that is helpful to people, then that's wonderful. That's kind of, I couldn't hope for much more than that. But yeah, I mean there's an interest. So Truman Capote, the novelist, I mean there are obviously kind of clinical definitions of anxiety, but the one that spoke to me was he talks about in his novel Breakfast at Tiffany's the mean reds, and it's like in contrast to the blues. The blues is a sort of slow kind of misery or depression that people feel, and there's a sort of passivity about it, and a kind of people get into a slump and they don't really want to do anything, whereas the mean reds, it being anxiety, is a sort of there's a sort of energy there, there's a kind of fight or flight sort of excitement. For me personally, that particular definition spoke to me, because I'm someone who ends up pacing around and having to be, anxiety has that kind of manifests itself in that way. Really, it's a kinetic sort of energetic state of mind for me personally. Agitation is a word that's very close to.
And nausea comes up, and agitation, and anguish, and such things. Going back to the supermarket, I'm interested that you've sort of started to understand that you're an anxious person, and yet to combat that, or an attempt to combat that, you try and become more independent. So you're almost self-diagnosing at a very young age, and then you set yourself a challenge one day to sort of walk home unassisted from school or something like that. So that was you traveling perhaps for the first time. And then in your mid-20s, tell us about your mid-20s and how you sort of got on.
I mean, it's funny because I think I did some good work on myself without really realising it necessarily in my teens, like say, trying to become more independent. And my sort of first travels alone in my kind of late teens. And I went off to university and I partied a bit hard, let's say, and got, sort of experimented with certain substances, let's say, as people of, my generation, maybe yours, maybe everyone's generation, I don't know, since the 60s knows something about that. But and then there was a I think that probably, so in my early 20s this sort of anxiety issue came back in a bad way, and it was probably fueled by sort of not great sort of not hugely healthy decisions I made about sort of what I put into my body in my student years. But also I think it was to do with a bit of an existential crisis about what I'm going to do with my life. You leave university with a degree in English literature and you want to be a writer, and you find out that isn't necessarily, you don't suddenly become a novelist or a travel writer or a journalist, and you're kind of, hang on, I've put all this work in and I've got all these kind of role models and heroes who seem to succeed in this path, and it's like, why isn't it happening to me? And so if it's not happening to me, who am I? How do I define myself? And so there was that kind of, I sort of say, like some people have talk about a midlife crisis. I had my midlife crisis when I was about 24, as you know.
So full of angst and dread and uncertainty.
Yeah, and I think also precarity. I mean, a point I make in the book, I hope comes over, is that, anxiety is a very personal experience and it's unique. There are certain characteristics that are unique to each person and different to each person. That's very important, I think, to respect that and understand that. But I think there are kind of social conditions that cause anxiety. My day job, I'm an academic, and I teach young people every day. I interact with young people every day. And the kind of difficulties they face, the sort of precarity of work, if I thought I had it bad in my early 20s in the sort of turn of the millennium, it's as nothing compared to the sort of challenges that my students face, And that is, as I say, that's something that's socially and politically constructed, I would say, in the sense that we don't, there could be better paid work, there could be better jobs out there for people, there could be, I think we could talk about social media and the impact of that, although that's probably a topic for a completely different...
well, maybe not.
Maybe not. We can...
While we're talking about your job at university, you're a senior lecturer, right? In creative...
Associate professor now, not that it makes much difference, but
Associate professor, excuse me.
For now, anyway.
Creative writing and global journalism, right? So, and I've been down to the university and taught a little bit there as well. Thinking about generations and how they differ and what they're exposed to and vulnerable to now that maybe we weren't to the same degree. What's the mood like down there? What patterns of behaviour are you noticing among the cohort you've got there in the context of what we're talking about here?
A lot of anxiety, for sure, to the point where, it's very difficult for, when you try to compel students to do presentations, they have that stage fright, that kind of performance anxiety, which just means that basically it's not really worth having a corridor full of people panting and having panic attacks when you're just trying to help them to communicate their ideas about their article that they want to write. So it's quite it's quite serious, I think, and it's a kind of epidemic. And I think there are other linked sort of, problems that come from kind of certain kinds of neurodivergencies and depression, and it is, and I think that's why I felt that I can identify with it because I've I suffer with that myself, and I certainly suffered as a young person. But it also seemed to be, it was another reason to write the book, because it seems to be something that we need to address, as a sort of culture and part of the kind of zeitgeist, dare I say, to do that.
Yeah, when you were 25, I remember, ish, you were at the job centre and you mentioned to the job coach, or whatever his title was back then, that you might not be able to do certain types of work because of your, by then diagnosed, anxiety. And he basically told you to man up, didn't he?
Yeah.
Do you think we're starting to talk differently about anxiety these days?
Definitely. Yeah. It's much better. Our general approach, I think, as a culture than it was then. I think that it's not perfect, and it's not, I think there is. I mean, I think often sometimes, and I suppose I go back to the point I made about, some of the kind of social reasons and cultural reasons for anxiety.
Yeah.
I think there's that. We have these posters up in the university where I work, and you see them a lot, which is it's okay to not be okay, or something like that, and that's a perfectly valid sentiment, but it begs the question, well, how do we, what next? How do we sort of make things a bit easier?
Yeah.
If anxiety is a sort of fact of life and a fundamental aspect of the human experience, which I kind of think it may be, we still, even so, I think we could still try to do as much as we can to, mitigate unhelpful forms of anxiety. Some forms of anxiety are necessary when you're travelling. It means you're on your guard, and you're going to not hopefully get something nicked, or you're not going to fall foul of a scam. You know this, Ben, as an hugely experienced traveller yourself. There's a sort of healthy, almost kind of evolutionary anxiety that. Healthy anxiety sounds like a strange kind of contradiction in terms, doesn't it? But you get what I mean. Whereas I think these kind of unnecessary, really debilitating forms of anxiety that I've had my fair share of, and certainly a lot of my students suffer. We could be doing more to address that.
Yeah, I think it's partly the precarity you mentioned, and that existential dread and uncertainty, but also what I sometimes call comparisonitis.
Yeah.
Comparison being the thief of joy and all of that. And we did it when we were kids, and crikey, they must be doing it an awful lot more now. And I wonder, in the context of travel, they're comparing the experience of being in, say, Paris or Venice with their expectations of that place. And it was easier for our generation to arrive somewhere having seen nothing of it in advance. These days, previews are inevitable, really. And you mentioned something called Paris syndrome, which is when travellers arrive in Paris and they've seen so much of it in advance, such a romanticised version of Paris, that when they get there, they sort of collapse in a malaise. They can't handle the discrepancy between the expectation and the reality. So that a little bit of that must be going on with Gen Z. Do you think in the context of travel?
Oh, I think so. Yeah, the Paris syndrome has been around since the 80s, and it was mostly Japanese tourists who came to Paris. It was noticed that they would have these kind of mental health crises for exactly the reason you mentioned. So there's nothing new about that phenomenon, but I think with the kind of technologies that we have today, where it's because when I was reading about Paris syndrome, it was Japanese tourists who had picked up brochures in Tokyo or wherever, and we all know that brochures have always kind of, it's a bit like pictures of food in certain kinds of restaurants. Like you see the picture and it's this sort of gorgeous looking, and then you get served the food and it's not quite.
It's like my Tinder profile, to be honest.
So the proliferation of images and so many different kinds of platforms where that what did you call it, comparisonitis, can really take hold, I think is a that's a kind of modern spin on it that really is probably causes a whole host of other anxieties.
And you mention you reference a lot of books and research, and it's all sort of elegantly weaved together. It's a real pleasure to read. I felt that there wasn't really a word or a syllable out of place in terms of how the narrative flowed. And in many ways it's more than a travel book or an account of anxiety when travelling. It's a book about life and being a human being, and it could easily be placed on a different shelf or on a different table. But I suppose that if your publisher published it as a sort of memoir and it was just Tom Sykes, my life so far, it might have been a bit more of a struggle to pitch, right? Because it's as if only celebrities get to talk about their experiences of being human. And I guess there's an obvious commercial reason for that, but I won't labour the point. It's a very, very good and enjoyable and memorable book.
Thank you.
And one of the books you mention in it is The Anxious Generation by
Jonathan Haidt. Yeah.
And you quote him as saying there's an emptiness or a hole in pretty much all of us, which causes a striving, and this could be happening unconsciously, right? And this amounts to maybe a level of anxiety that we're not conscious of, but it's happening to all of us at some level. And do you think that's correct?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're all, as human beings, we're all, one theory as to what kind of distinguishes us from other animals is that we kind of have, we're sort of looking for some kind of meaning and purpose beyond just basic survival, physical survival. And I think, it's how you fill that hole. And I think, not being denying that to yourself or society denying that to you will cause anxiety. I mean, and there's nothing new about that. There's a lot of, great people far smarter than me who have been kind of commenting on that for centuries, if not thousands of years. I mean, one of the things that while I don't dispense advice, I'm careful not to dispense advice in the book, I do try and talk about some things that have helped me, and I think creativity. One of the activities that helps to fill that void is creativity, and certainly, I mean, when people, it seems like a tall order for people, perhaps many people, but this has certainly been cathartic for me. To write a book about my anxiety has helped me to kind of be a less anxious person. I'm kind of waiting. It's only been out a couple of months, and I'm sort of so far so good. And then I'll probably have a panic attack, and I'll say, no, it hasn't worked. And I'll kind of be proven wrong. But so far, the travels I've done since finishing the book, with a toddler in tow, which you'd think would bring additional anxieties, and it does.
Yeah.
But it's been quite manageable. So I think, writing a whole book about your anxiety, might be a tall order for some. But I think even if you just, however you creatively respond, whether you write a song about it or you draw. I mentioned John Ruskin in the book, who, via Alain de Botton, who's, in fact, you recommended that excellent book to me, is The Art of Travel. And he talks about, it's a bit second-hand because I'm talking about Alain de Botton, I'm talking about Ruskin. But
who was Ruskin? Ruskin
was a kind of Victorian thinker and scholar, very sort of respected in his time. And he had this theory that whenever you travel anywhere or any kind of life experience, you should try and record it. And he was particularly talking about drawing or writing, I think it can apply to. But the crucial point for him was that it didn't matter whether it was any good or not. It didn't matter whether you could draw or write. I mean, who really decides that anyway? That's very subjective anyway, But, and it didn't matter whether you were going to try to write it and publish it or draw something and, get an exhibition off the back of it and that's not the point. The point is to kind of record and reflect on your experience. And for him, that was a kind of nourishing and really sort of positive activity to pursue, And I think, there are also ideas around sort of flow states. I talk about something that helped me was to go into a bookshop like this in Manila in the Philippines when I was having not quite a panic attack, but kind of intolerable levels of anxiety. And I found myself drawn to these books of sort of reproductions of the paintings of Ferdinand Amor-Solo, who's a kind of great Philippine artist. And there are these sort of extraordinary kind of paintings of the kind of bucolic countryside of the Philippines and the people sort of working the land, very kind of romantic, a bit like maybe John Constable. I mean, I don't know enough about art, but I'd say that maybe someone like John Constable is kind of an equivalent. And I just found myself leafing through these extraordinary, looking at these paintings, and sort of suddenly my attention was kind of focused on, I'd left that kind of anxious frame of mind and I was somewhere else. And people liken it to, that flow state to when you're a kid and you go out playing for hours and hours and hours in the summer, and you forget about the passage of time. You forget about, you're playing a game of whatever, soldiers or whatever fantasy or kind of, fantasy game you're playing, and you're just in that moment. And it's only when your mum calls you in for tea or something like that, that you snap out of it and you're back into the real world. So those flow states are just really good to get into. People do it through meditation, people do it through art, people do it through play. Sport is another route to that kind of flow state. So that's another way of, as I say, sort of filling that void.
Yeah, no, it's often occurred to me that one of the reasons I appreciate travelling so much is that you accidentally enter a prolonged state of mindfulness.
Absolutely.
Because everything is novel and therefore worthy of regard and curiosity. Not to say that your own familiar environment isn't deserving of those things, but you know what I mean? You do it more instinctively. And before you know it, 6, 7, 8 hours have passed before your brain has done what it likes to do, which is dwell on those pet concerns and insecurities and fears and whatnot. But reading your account of travelling in India, in Africa, in the Philippines, it's hard to come away with a clear idea of whether travel is good or bad for anxiety. Do you know what I mean? Can you talk us through that? Because on one hand, you do enter these sort of mindful flow states because of difference and diversity and everything being curious and different. But then also you're beset by things that are uncertain and out of your control, and crowds, that's an issue.
And even more complicated than that, some of the worst panic attacks I sort of describe in the book are not obviously triggered by, clearly anxiety-inducing surroundings. For example, so I'm sat in a room with academics, again in Manila on another occasion. No, they're on the same trip actually, with, I'm trying to set up a kind of research relationship between the university where I work and a university in Manila. And we're sitting down, I'm being fed this delicious food. We're talking about the Philippines, which is a part of the world that's fascinated me for many years. And I'm feeling almost blissfully happy, and we're getting somewhere with this relationship that we're setting up, and suddenly the heart starts beating like John Bonham's kick drum, and the throat goes dry, and I'm catastrophizing, and I'm initially I'm sort of saying, I just feel a bit sick, and then it's clear that that's not going to cut it. So I take the risk of saying to my host, look, I'm suffering from anxiety. And her reaction is the worst possible reaction. It's, what have we done to upset you, Dr. Tom? I was like, no, it's not you. And you thinking that you're to blame for it now has just made my anxiety much worse. Not that I said that to her, but that's what I thought. So it's a puzzle. It really is a puzzle for me, because I compare that to literally having kind of guns pointed at me on the Ghana Cote d'Ivoire border shortly after the Second Civil War ended, because I was travelling there and reporting. And for some reason in that situation I stayed completely calm. I just kind of, I hope I'm not going to get shot, because it's probably a bit of a bureaucratic mess for them to So it. What am I trying to say? I suppose it's just for me that again, it's the reason why I felt like I had to write about this and to try and figure this out for myself. Really, the puzzle of my own anxiety. In answer to your question, I think despite all those kind of anomalies and strange aspects of the situation, I mean, I think I have to believe that travel. It's worth. I would be much worse if I hadn't travelled. If I just said, I don't think I can be bothered this time. I'm not gonna. I'm just gonna. If off the back of one of those early anxious travels, I'd said, okay, sod that, I'm never going to do it again. That would have been worse, I think, for me.
Didn't you receive some advice along those lines when you were in your early 20s?
I did, from a friend of mine, a close friend of mine, Alex, who, at the same kind of time, he was starting to suffer from anxiety. So we were, kind of brothers in that sort of sense. But yeah, that's exactly what he said to me, is that don't just become a hermit. Don't close yourself off from the world, because you only make it worse, because it's, for the reasons we've kind of talked about, really, that you've got to try and sort of push yourself and kind of, overcome these fears. And
so there's something in that old idea, that old adage of, the best way to deal with a fear is to confront it and conquer it.
I think to a certain extent, yeah. I think you do have to kind of push yourself to do that, as hard as it is. But I think you also need to be motivated to do that and kind of helped to do that. And I go back to what I said earlier about, our society not necessarily being... And I was lucky that I had friends who said that to me. Some of the young people I know today who are kind of really battling with anxiety, they don't have that kind of support. They don't have someone necessarily, something even as simple as that, as to sort of say, someone to say, look, just feel the fear and do it anyway, to quote the title of that kind of self-help book about this. But
halfway through the book, we sort of move away from India and Manila and go to Nigeria, don't we? Why is that? What happened?
The short answer to that is because I married a Nigerian woman, and so it was really the kind of natural next steps of our relationship necessitated going to Nigeria, which I was very much looking forward to. I mean, I had worked quite extensively in Ivory Coast and Ghana, and so I had I've always had a interest in West Africa.
Was she sympathetic when you came out to her about your anxiety? Because there are cultural differences, aren't there?
Completely, yeah. Initially, she kind of tutted and said, my Nigerian girlfriends, who have kind of come to the West, have kind of come to this conclusion that you don't want to go out with a Western man because they're all alcoholics and they've all got mental health issues. And I sort of had to say, guilty as charged. So yeah, there was she had assumptions, that were not entirely wrong.
Off the mark.
But no, I think once we got talking, she then kind of admitted to having, it's a universal feeling. It manifests itself in different ways culturally, and also historically. I talk about, I might read that bit. I don't know if people want to, about my ancestor who sort of... Emil, my Jewish ancestor who emigrated to the UK from Germany. I tried to put myself in his head, wondering whether there's anything genetic about this, whether I would have, he had the same kind of horrors that I had.
One of my questions was going to be, does anxiety travel? Can that travel down through generations? Because your great-grandfather crossed the channel in desperation, in a boat, fleeing hardship, persecution, and he would have faced all sorts of challenging situations and been anxious, no doubt.
Yeah.
And is there any evidence that it can be sort of genetically passed down? Do you know anything along those lines?
Yeah, I don't think so much, actually. I think it is more kind of situational and more...
if you have a nervous partner, you're more likely to imitate them.
Well, I suppose that's the... Yeah, I mean, certainly my mum's side of the family, and that's the side descended from Emil, have always been kind of, I don't know, it's like more open to, or it's a double-edged sword because like more tolerant of anxiety, but then also more anxious in a way that is likely to kind of then probably inspire the next generation or make the next generation anxious. So yeah, it's a good question as to sort of how much of it is passed down through behaviour or whether there is. I don't think there's an anxiety gene. I don't know. It's maybe Richard Dawkins has got a book about it somewhere. We could look it up.
But no, it would be great to hear a section from that.
Should I do that? Yeah, I'll read about good old Emil. And then we should talk a little bit about shitty breaks, and then I think we have to go. So
What's the time now?
7:38. Have we got about 40? Was it 45 minutes?
Yeah.
And then have we got time for questions after
Yes,
that?
of course. About 15 to 20 minutes.
That's fine. Yeah. Great. Okay. How anxious was Emil Hollanders when he crossed the English Channel in 1858? From Kempen, now in Western Germany, my forefather may have been born too soon and not easterly enough to have suffered in the pogroms. In these grisly rampages, 100,000 Russian and Eastern European Jews were burned, clubbed, shot or stabbed to death by mobs whipped up by demagogues. Armies and police forces were often complicit in the violence. As a subject of the Kingdom of Prussia, Emil would have been used to and perhaps worn down by what we today call microaggressions. There and then, anti-Semitism was actively preached and spread in workplaces, schools, universities, social clubs, trade unions and taverns, writes the scholar Daniel Goldhagen. As I look at Emil's name in the 1861 census, rendered in graceful Zaftig handwriting, I picture him, a boy of 20, being cold-shouldered on that trip by Gentile passengers for his dark complexion and pointy features. If he knew much about Britain, he'd have been nervous about emigrating somewhere that didn't allow Jews to go to university, stand for parliament, or become civil servants. He may not have been wanted in his place of origin, or on the journey from it, or at his destination. Maybe I'm over-worrying about my dear ancestor, and he had a whale of a time on that voyage. Incidentally, in those days, he may have spotted fin or sperm whales on the way over. Perhaps he was optimistic about a better life ahead. Many immigrants have to be. Like other young Victorian men, he could have seen it all as a big adventure with fortune, glory, and a pretty girl, the prizes. He had prospects as a professional clock/watchmaker, a skill that was transferable once he'd settled in Portsmouth. Emil might therefore have laughed at the idea of me, his descendant, in a way cushier future, feeling even a pinch of dread while travelling in safety, with no risk of shipwreck or cholera, and no threat of racism or poverty at my point of departure or arrival. Another male ancestor on my maternal line relished risky travel, if a hand-me-down anecdote is accurate. Great-grandfather John was a rating on a Royal Naval ship dispatched to Archangel in 1918-19 to try to crush the Russian revolutionaries. The ship docked at a White Sea coastal town. Sent out alone on reconnaissance, John found that the place had been evacuated. With homes and shops deserted, he stole as many valuables as he could carry and returned to the ship. His CO asked if there was anything to report. With jewellery and watches bulging under his uniform, John duly said, "No, sir." He must have had a great poker face. Conforming to the worst stereotypes of the Jewish spiv, he apparently made a small fortune from selling these hooky items to colleagues on board and later civilians in Portsmouth after demob. Driving through Cherbourg to the cross-channel ferry port some years later, I see African men on pavements and roundabouts. They're about Emil's age when he'd split for the UK. They look at once listless and frantic, yawning and walking in circles around each other, or sitting on benches gazing at their phones while swinging their legs. Their bodies are moving without going anywhere. They're stuck between the place from which they came, to which they can't return after risking their lives to leave it, and two places that don't want them. France now, and if they do traverse the water, England. Whether you've done anything wrong or not, it's hard for the calmest person not to feel a flicker of fear going through immigration control wherever in the world you are. The beanie-hatted, puffer-jacketed police or frontière officer holds my passport up to the light and studies it with one eye closed, like a jeweller searching for a cutting error in a gemstone. He lowers the claret-bound document and stares at me, both eyes open. Nobody's passport photo ever looks like them, yet this has never caused me bureaucratic grief before. He pushes a pen and notepad across the desk. Write signature. Write my own name. This should be easy, automatic, second nature, but not in this state. I got little sleep last night and spent the morning stomping aimlessly around the campsite I'd been staying on with relatives. Already feeling disconnected from myself, now I must undergo these tests of selfhood. Is that picture of me really me? Can I prove that I am me by writing a signature that looks enough like the one in the passport, itself a document designed to prove that wherever I go in the world, I am me? If a passport photo resembles us less as our appearance changes from age, stress and poorly chosen haircuts, does our signature alter over time too? Even a small divergence between what I write now and what's in my passport could trap me in France on suspicion of illegal emigration, like the Africans earlier. As I shakily hold the pen over the notepad, I consider what else about ourselves changes, and whether these changes are so frequent and extreme that they make us contradictory to the core. Stop there.
And that was your favourite day of the holiday, right?
Yeah, those are the highlights. Ben, should we talk about shitty breaks?
No.
Oh, come on.
Questions now. My final question. I'd like to
ask you about
do a Sue Lawley on you and cast you away on a desert island. And you get to have a book and a piece of music and a person.
You get Shakespeare and the Bible for free, don't you? That used to be the rule?
Yeah, you can have those, yeah.
Can I swap out the Bible for it? No, sorry, I'm negotiating already. Oh, God, a book. Probably a really big... If you've got the complete works of Shakespeare, can you have the complete works of, like, any other author?
Yeah.
Can you?
Yeah, who would you go for?
Probably Oscar Wilde, actually. That would cheer me up and stop me getting anxious. I'd laugh a lot.
I thought you were going to say your own diaries, which would have been very Oscar Wilde, wouldn't it? One of his characters says something along those lines.
Yeah.
I'm depressed and feeling rotten. Nothing better for it than reading my own diaries.
Yeah.
So yeah, you have Oscar Wilde.
And music.
Yep.
How many do you have to name? Sorry.
Just one band or artist.
Or
Song.
It's usually songs, isn't it?
Yeah. What song would you
I'm tempted to say Psycho Killer, but I'm tense and nervous and I can't relax, But,
is that a lyric from the...
Yeah. Isn't it? Yeah. By Talking Heads, isn't it? Yeah. I mean, that would remind me of...
What's the band?
Just as things... Talking Heads,
Talking
sort
Heads,
of new wave punk.
Excuse my ignorance.
No, that's all right. Yeah.
Talking Heads, Psycho Killer, Oscar Wilde's collected works, and who are you going to have there with you?
Any person.
Your daughter or your wife?
Yeah. Oh God, Sophie's Choice style. Oh no, sorry I said that. Is it a famous person? I didn't know that part.
Yeah, go for a famous person. No, I think I'm making this up.
You are.
Yeah, I don't remember this. Yeah.
Okay. Well, we'll skip that.
I don't know, a comedian, someone to cheer me up. I don't know, just a comedian. Well, I can't think of George Carlin, except he's dead.
Sue Perkins?
Bill Hicks, no, he's dead, isn't he? No, sorry.
Sue Perkins?
Sue Perkins. Yeah, she's quite cool. She's quite jolly and friendly. And
do you think you'd be anxious on this island, Tom Sykes?
Probably, because you'd have to do all this kind of survivalist stuff to survive, like hunt and build. I can't do that. I can't even change a light bulb, really. That's about my limit of my kind of...
Now that I reflect, it was rather dim the last time I was at your house. Anyway, any questions from the audience? Yes.
Well, thank you so much. This was so entertaining. When my husband said, would you like to go, we're from the colonies, we're from Canada, by the way, traveled a long way to get here. And when my husband said, we're going to go to a book talk called The Anxious Traveler, I thought, why would I? I'm going to be traveling with him to get here, so why do I need to read a book about that? But anyway, I'm quite delighted and excited. You seem to be pulling together some of my most favorite themes of late. I love Jonathan Haidt's book about the anxious generation, because I'm very interested, like culturally we do have different things to worry about now, no longer saber-toothed tigers, but we do have all of the things that come up with social media. And there's two things, I guess as it relates to mindfulness as well. One of my observations is while traveling, there's more and more people that are traveling and completely unaware of where they are, except as to how they look in the frame of their iPhone photo that someone else is taking of them. And so, as it relates to normally, I would say travel is such a flow state. I spent 14 hours in Paris last week and don't know where the time went. But when you are not actually looking at the British Museum or the pyramids or the other wonders of the world, you're missing out on that flow state so much. So I guess that's combining. So my question would be, I'd heard somewhere that somebody did a little study and they said that the best time of the trip is 6 weeks before, or when you're planning it, because you've got the shiny brochures and the websites and it's all exciting. And then like 6 weeks after, or in the retelling, because the actual physical act of traveling is often fraught with such, you're hot, you're cold, you're hungry, the plane's late. Like it's actually mostly misery, except in advance or looking backwards. Do you think that's true?
Yeah, and yes, I think that's a really interesting kind of theory actually, because also it's I think when people come back from a holiday, they kind of give edited highlights, don't they? Of like, nobody wants to be bummed out by your stories of, I missed this bus and I felt anxious when I met that person, and and it might be that actually those, I mean, we've all been on probably disastrous family holidays. That was a bit of one there I read to you. Or just trips that have not worked out, whether you're an anxiety sufferer or not, the trips often don't work out very, and I think when people travel for Christmas, it's quite often a disaster, because it's, people that, you see family members you don't necessarily want to see, and all this kind of stress of putting on the dinner and all this sort of stuff. But when you do come to recount it, as you're kind of saying, the onus is on you or it's expected that you kind of pick out the positives, the best bit. But it might be that those positives were only for like a fraction of that trip, and the rest of the time you spent worrying or arguing or about it. So I think that's true. Like, and also speaks to kind of like how we remember things and how selectively we remember things. And I think in a way I was trying to do the opposite of that and remember all the bad stuff and all the unpleasant stuff that I probably had to repress on these trips, because I mean it goes back really from throughout my whole time I've been traveling, really since childhood, and I think suddenly when I got into writing, nobody's in when you're fulfilling a kind of journalistic assignment, or you're writing a kind of book of reportage or something, nobody wants to be bummed out by you coming in and saying I was really depressed or miserable or didn't know how to feel about this and woe me kind of thing. People are interested in finding out about the external world. They want to know the facts of a culture or a place or whatever it is. So in a way I took out the lowlights and if you like, and put them in the book,
Well, there's also no real, it's interesting, we spend so much of our lives trying to be comfortable and have bad things not happen, but the hero's journey, or like any archetype you decide to look at with humanity, I can't think of a single book that I would want to read about, like, I started off life and everything went perfectly and nothing happened. There are no books like that.
Without conflict and struggle and anxiety, there's no meaning and there's no story. I mean, you're quite right. We don't, any story that's told, when when the hero gets what they want, that's just the end. When, I don't know, Indiana Jones walks off into the sunset with it, it's their struggle to get there, isn't it? That's really the what people are interested in. And I think the same goes for, I mean, I do a bit of mock that a little bit in the book by sort of giving a sort of false narrative of, like, I got on a train in Britain and it was cheap and there were no hold-ups at all. Yeah. And then I got on a plane and everyone was really nice and it was really nice food and not rubbery kind of crap, And I got to...
And then you woke up?
Yeah, yeah. And I was like, and I sort of say, if this was as boring for you to read as it was for me to write, I hope I'm making a point about how certain kinds of obstacles and anxieties need to sort of...
That reminds me of the Sunday Times travel section, what you just paraphrased.
We've all done it. We've all needed the
Which
needed
is
the money.
an issue, isn't it? When travel writers feel that they have to sort of be positive and essentially write an advert, rather than truthful, honest, introspective travel writing. I think it's harder and harder to get paid to do that these days. Any more questions? Chris at the front. Yeah.
I think, as Ben mentioned, like the kind of the motivation to travel as someone who experiences anxiety might seem quite a kind of an interesting or odd choice in some ways. But do you think part of the kind of motivation for it might be that, like, if you're undergoing a lot of stresses or changes in your life, like the return to normal life, quote unquote, is kind of like an even greater sense of normalcy or calm after kind of disrupting it temporarily in some way? Do you think that that's part of maybe what's to be said for pushing those comfort zones, is that when you are not experiencing that kind of flux or change on a day-to-day basis that we all do when we travel, that it kind of refreshes your perspective in everyday life after that?
Yes, I think you're quite right. And I think for me, that's happened in relatively recent times. Like I think for because of the kind of precarity that we're talking about, and doing a fair share of sofa surfing and travelling around and not having kind of gainful employment for a lot of my youth, I never felt settled. I never really had a sense of home. But I think since I've been able to afford a home that I'm reasonably proud of, that feeling of the return. Again, it goes back to the hero's journey, doesn't it? That kind of return to normalcy, that rupture, and then coming back and and also having a small, I don't want to get mushy, but having a small child at home and actually being like, homesickness is a weird feeling. It's a very recent thing for me to actually miss my baby, and I'm going to cry if I keep looking at pictures of her and stuff. But you're quite right. It's something that some people I think feel that from the very beginning. There's no place like home, and that kind of feeling of home and kind of rootedness to where you come from or where you originated from. And now I feel it keenly, since I've sort of put down roots, I suppose. And but yeah, I did quite enjoy being like the wanderer who, kind of never really, that worked for me for that period of my life. Of sort of feel like because if you're not at home anywhere, the flip side of that is you can make yourself quickly at home wherever you are. Do you think that's right, Ben? And sort of given your, I'm trying to bring us back to shitty breaks, but you're being too modest. But
I was just thinking of
'cause you've done a lot of-
Dorothy and Oz and the Yellow Brick Road.
yeah,
But yeah, Lara.
yeah.
Yeah, I was wondering, is your anxiety proportional to how far from home you are?
For me personally, no, because one of the worst panic attacks I had was during the lockdown, sitting in my house in Portsmouth. I woke up one morning, made myself a cup of tea, and thought I was dying, thought I was having a heart attack, and that was a consequence of, again, it doesn't, that was like not being, that felt like because I'd been constricted, I hadn't been able to go anywhere or travel for ages, as we all were grounded at that time. But I was on my own, and I was lonely, I was really, and I wasn't able to see anyone. And if you were kind of locked
Just before
down,
you met your wife.
yeah, and your world becomes this limited to the 20 minutes you're allowed to do some exercise, whatever, and the daily buying of as much beer as you can pack into your, which was kind of sadly my existence. I wasn't the only one, I think. So no, for me, there's no kind of, but I mean, I dare say that, probably for other people, the further you go, and maybe the also depending on kind of how remote the place is. I mean, I quite like solitude up to a point, but in the book I interviewed a colleague of mine, and also a very a brilliant writer, Victoria Leslie. She's a novelist and a sort of fiction writer, and she likes nothing more than to go to like the remotest parts of like Scottish islands, and what keeps her going is she just has a pile of books, And I'm like, don't you miss your partner? It's like, well, no, not for, no. So, you know, like, I'll see him and I'll come home and I'll see him in 3 weeks' time or something. And she'll do these long cycle rides. And for her, the idea of absolute peace and calm and the opposite of anxiety is to be absolutely nowhere near anybody else for as long as possible. Horses for courses, I don't know. Yeah.
Okay, any more questions?
Have you had anxiety while travelling with your child, and why?
I have, but it hasn't become kind of like pathological, and or uncontrollable, you know. So I mean, I went to Atlanta, Georgia in January for a conference, and this was booked before the events in the United States where they decided to, you know, the kind of clamp down on migration. And also before I knew that there was going to be an ice storm sweeping across North America, which was going to make, and then so I was kind of, but even without knowing all that, I was just thinking, it's a bit, you know, my daughter was not even 1 at that point, and I was thinking, do we want to, my wife was like, no, why not, let's do it, you know, let's get her travelling as soon as possible. I was like, you sure? Yeah, we'll bring the pram and we'll be fine. It's like, okay. So there was a lot of anxiety in the build-up to it. Once things became people, and I had colleagues saying, "Do you want to take some of your Facebook posts down, Tom? Because now they check your social media when you arrive in the United States, and they're banning people." I was like, "Yeah, I'll do that. And then the ice storm comes into like about 2 days before, and I'm like, you know, I'm saying to my wife, like, "Do we really want to do this?" And then the day while we're traveling, I kid you not, on the train to Heathrow. I don't know whether it was actually announced that day, but I find out that there's this kind of blacklist, if you like, of countries where they're going to be where the US is going to demand extra evidence and expect you to have a bazillion quid in the bank if you come to the US because they're worried that you might stay there illegally. And my wife's Nigerian, of course Nigeria is on that list. Luckily we realised she's got her visa before this cut-off point, so she's going to be right. But with all that kind of swimming around my head, thinking like, we do not want to arrive and then get deported for any number of these reasons. So there was a lot of pre-anxiety, but it was pre-anxiety. Is that, I don't know, pre-travel anxiety before you get traveling or whatever. But when we arrived, it was such a relief. It could not have been easier. I don't think I've ever had an easier entry into a country. I mean, I think it was because places like Atlanta compared to New York or San Francisco or Los Angeles are not places where if people are planning to illegally, I shouldn't say no one is illegal, of course, but you know that's the kind of phrase that's used. You know, immigrate. It's not somewhere that they necessarily expect that to happen. So we arrived, and it could not have been easier and nicer. I ended up chatting to the immigration official there who kind of stamped our passports was probably like an English major, because we just talked about literature for about 20 minutes, and he asked me, he's like, what's your latest book? You know, he said, is it any good? I said, I don't know, but I dropped a copy off for him on the way back. I don't know whether he read Officer Perkins or something, and I just left it for him. So it couldn't have been nicer and easier. And, you know, and it was fine. We were there, and, you know, my daughter was very calm. She managed to sleep on both for almost the duration of both flights. I was like, maybe this is the key. This is how my wife and I get it. We have to fly everywhere. It would cost a fortune. But this is how we get on a plane as often as possible. And yeah, anyway.
And maybe finishing on that note of flying, one of the things that you mentioned that amused me and intrigued me was that fear of flying, which is aerophobia, is like a bazillion times higher than fear of driving or being in a vehicle, right? And that's amoxophobia or something like that?
Yes. Yeah.
And yet you're far more likely, a bazillion times more likely to be injured or hurt in a car than you are a plane.
Especially in Nigeria, and there's a few near misses.
On that cheerful note, but no, it makes an interesting point about how irrational fear and anxiety and phobias can be, right? And it's maybe the first thing we ought to do when we struggle with them is to interrogate them somewhat and get to the drill into the numbers a little bit.
Yeah, I think, yes, facts and evidence and science might have gone out of fashion in certain quarters of our kind of culture and society, but it's very important. I mean, I'm not an ignorance is bliss guy at all. I think quite the opposite. I think the more you can learn and understand about the world, hopefully the less anxious you'll be, you know.
Yeah.
Hopefully, yeah.
Well, Tom, thank you very much.
Thank you, Ben.
I reiterate, it's an
Yeah, yeah.
excellent book, and I encourage you all to steal a copy.
And Brian read all of Ben's superb books as
I
well.
write mostly erotic poetry, so if that's your thing, Diego.
Can I, thank you.
Thank you so much, both of you. That was really interesting. Just to let you know,